Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar, Designing Wellbeing-centred NHS Workplaces. This is going to be the first episode in a three-part series of webinars we're running called The Future Workplace of the NHS. We've been working with the NHS over the past few years, really, and been kind of talking to NHS Trusts for a lot longer than that regarding their kind of space struggles, a combination of a mixture of clinical and office spaces, old and new builds, kind of incomplete booking systems, and changing work environments in the kind of post-COVID era have led to quite a complex situation in which quite a lot of space is being either incorrectly used or underutilised, and some spaces are completely heaving. There are estimates regarding kind of the extent of this underutilisation, which put cost estimates to around about £1 billion in energy and rent wasted every year. So that's kind of why we're looking at exploring this, sharing the insights we've gained through working with trusts and similar kind of research hospitals and clinical spaces to kind of see what we can do to readdress those issues. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at the actual kind of processes and change management operations that are needed to design workplaces that support staff and varied work patterns, and then move on to look at the actual kind of data behind those insights. So looking at what metrics to look at to identify high pressure situations and where you can kind of reevaluate and maybe repurpose some spaces. We'll then move on to looking at how we can kind of give something back to employees when consolidating space, so not just looking at it from a kind of operational and baseline cost view, but actually making sure that it's functional and usable. And then kind of like the underlying theme or conclusion, we'll be looking at how this data that you're gathering across your spaces can be used to support long-term and short-term decision-making, constantly keeping an eye on your bottom line of spend. Today's speakers joining us from OpenSensors are Yodit, Stanton, our CEO and founder, and Nguyen, our head of product. So first things first, I think probably over to Yodit, if you could give a very brief kind of summary of what you're involved in the company and kind of what it is you're doing.
Yes, hi. My name is Yodit. I have been working on OpenSensors for over 10 years. So working a long time in the industry, learning a lot. The industry has evolved a bunch. Pre-COVID, there was a lot of very smart people talking about activity-based working, kind of creating environments with, I guess, what we're calling kind of hybrid, but how does the design affect the space in a sense of like how to have the right types of space that people want to use and so forth. Whilst it was fairly mainstream, I think what COVID did is accelerate adoption by force to where now the expectation in terms of hiring and anything else is that there's a baseline expectation that there will be flexibility built in. And that really fundamentally changes the relationship of what the design and what that means. If we move away from one desk for one person, the world looks like much more complex, exciting but complex. There is peaks and ups and downs in utilization, and what is the right kind of person to desk ratio became kind of the ultimate question that everyone's trying to figure out. To now I think people kind of the early stages of systemization, which I think is what we'll be talking about more, is creating kind of not going kind of overspending before proving, going after kind of low-hanging fruit, and so on. So overall, yeah, it's a big topic, but I'm looking forward to the chat today.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Vu, over to you from, I guess, a product point of view. What is it that you're kind of involved in, and what are you seeing changing largely across the industry?
Hi, yeah, my name is Vu and I run the product team. I've also been working in this industry for over 10 years. We start out from very basic analytics and hardware where we just show you the utilization over time, and things have been evolving quite drastically post-pandemic era. And I'm responsible for the data science team as well. What we look at is usually detecting the patterns, and we have noticed for the last few years that even though a lot of our clients have very similar hybrid working schedule, but the behavior of different offices is drastically different from each other, especially even between in the healthcare industry where things can change from people working in the hospital, for staff working in the faculty members, and so on and so forth. Everything is changing quite a bit, and we'll break it down in this webinar just to show you how you can take a look at that patterns and decide what to do with it.
Brilliant. Thank you. Right, so we might as well dive straight in and look at the actual kind of like macro process of how you do design an efficient workplace. And I'm going to go over to you, Yodit, first. As you've been kind of running projects pre and post COVID for a while now, and kind of ask, is there any way of running a project or like kind of structuring a project that you're seeing be more successful in terms of start point and end point now that things are more varied than it was before?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that as the maturation of the use case and the understanding and the need of the industry has happened, the maturation of the technologies has happened as well. So firstly, just to touch on, for workplaces, whether they are clinical spaces or offices and meeting rooms, like what we mean by sensors. What we're talking about essentially is there's many types of sensors in general, but for this kind of conversation, we are talking about utilization sensors, which are kind of in the bucket of there's types of sensors that tell you about kind of motion, somebody's around, or there's counting, these are the number of people in this meeting room or in this kind of even footfall. And then on the other side, there's also kind of environmental sensors around all sorts. And we're not talking about that now, but in later webinars, we will be talking about that. And essentially, now we've got to the case where, 10 years ago when we started, getting good battery life out of sensors was nearly impossible. 6 months was kind of a dream. To a decade plus long battery life, and even counters, which is also kind of quite interesting. So over the last year, we've been implementing counting technology that is battery based, so that the kind of major electric works that were necessary in previous years that we've had to do to put in counters in large sites with meeting room counters is now battery based. So I think the technology matured, and now there's also an understanding that as the technology is getting kind of portable, the approach should be portable, kind of not just throwing around a bunch of sensors in areas, but to be a bit more intelligent and have before and after samplings and so forth.
Yeah, and that, I guess that kind of makes sense with the difference in use cases we're seeing now as well, or the different goals that companies are having. Because historically we would be censoring every floor of an office all at once, kind of just to get an understanding of who's where. But now a lot of the time the conversation is geared to how do we reduce this space? How do we manage more people in a smaller space, which isn't one-to-one? So there is a lot more kind of moving involved. Vu, have you got anything to add to that, or would you like to kind of touch on?
I can talk a little bit more about the approach we are taking with our clients for the last few years. Just as David mentioned, before COVID, we used to do these huge installations that cover sometimes entire buildings, several buildings, and sometimes entire campus. And they, the sensor stayed there permanently, and you measure. Before COVID, most of the time people are doing smaller optimizations where you kind of like, oh, there's a bunch of offices on second floor, so maybe we can assign it to somebody else, take them and exchange between different departments. But nowadays, and the solution was great, but it was costly because we're talking about thousands of sensors and maintaining them and deploying them and manage them and over time, and it was costly for our clients. But now we're taking a much more nimble and fast approach where we do study of 3 to 6 months, and we also client to deploy in smaller areas if they want to study second floor, for example, or perhaps one department at a time. And within 3 months, we get the data that can help them make the first kind of plan for changing. That's what we call, identify the low-hanging fruit. And we have noticed that with a lot of our clients, within the first 3 months, you can see immediately which areas are problematic. And then we help our clients create the reports in a way that is targeted specifically for the goals at hand, and then present it to the stakeholders. So while the conversation with the stakeholder is ongoing, and change management plan is being created, we can move the sensors to another location, start a new study with the different departments, because we notice that when the data is just the first part, the change afterwards is sometimes taking a bit of time. There's planning, sometimes there's a redesign, review, you have to get a new architect, and so on and so forth. But with this approach, we can identify the problem very quickly and move from space to space. Meanwhile, the other part of change management is ongoing. And we have noticed that throughout the last few years, there are some small projects going, and they keep getting larger and larger, and there are changes that are happening, and things that we sensor a couple of years ago now are actually becoming completely new spaces, completely new redesign. So that approach is much more cost efficient from the deployment standpoint, but also much faster to get the results back.
Yeah, that all makes sense. It kind of leads nicely into my next question, because Yodit mentioned the hardware is kind of maturing, and we're learning more and more about what approach to take with projects. So if I go back to you, Yodit, and ask, just what are kind of like the key fundamentals you think people should be looking for in a solution which supports these kind of phased or multi-phase approaches to projects?
Yes, I think as a first priority, we always had, I guess, an ethos or an outlook from the very start that sensors should not be touching the human Wi-Fi, so or human networks, and to be as standalone as possible from existing customer networks. So, as the stack is sensors to gateway to a dashboard and intelligence, that we answer that by really kind of keeping it off the networks. And I think that should be the standard that anyone kind of asks for from the get-go. Like I said, now we're going into kind of electrics and all of that also being standalone and kind of within its own sandbox. The extensibility of LoRa WAN as a kind of open protocol also means that like other sensors can join the network over time. You don't have to figure out exactly what you need from the get-go. There are many manufacturers that will manufacture even things like parking sensors that talk over this network and so on. So it gives you the ability to scale as you need it for whatever needs will be kind of it's future-proofed, as it were.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Well, Vu, do you have any thoughts on the hardware we're seeing developed, or are you kind of just in agreement with Yodit?
Yeah, it is quite exciting because, when I first started, the sensor would cost a few $100 and they are clunky and the battery doesn't last as much, or you have, especially for the counters where you count people, you have to build electrical outlets specifically to power them, and it's becoming much more expensive and harder to deploy. when you involve code, for buildings and reconstructing the floor or the ceilings and so on. Nowadays, pretty much everything can be powered by battery, and the hardware become much more efficient. Battery can last for a long time. They are all very secure. We have encryption end to end, all the way from the user to our cloud system. And we have worked with a very few health institutions and different NHS trusts. So we understand the security issues, the privacy issues. We have this new hardware where you can sensor top down without detecting, identify any individual person. So for us, keeping the data private and keeping identity of the people involved completely private is our main goal. That's it.
Cool. Sweet. So, well, we've touched quite heavily on the importance of early doors, identifying that low-hanging fruit. So we might as well dive straight back in and carry on with Yuvu, actually, into the data we actually look at and the way we present it in terms of identifying those underutilized areas and areas which can be easily repurposed. So yeah, if you want to speak a bit to that, that'd be really great.
Yeah, as we move from the model where we do permanent installations over the years, we now do much shorter studies in small spaces. It's all customizable depending on what our clients need and what the industry needs at the moment. When we do something like that, we notice, especially in the healthcare institutions, there's a lot of empty spaces, and the amount of square footage being utilized can be detected within the first few months, and sometimes they're huge. So you can separate the data by different categories. So, for example, by type of offices, by department, so you can see which department utilize their offices efficiently. Based on the data from the sensor, we can see, for example, in this chart, the amount of square footage that are underutilized in office area. You can see that conference room are being heavily utilized, which is very common. A lot of people tend to go into a meeting rooms and use that for a meeting or sometimes just to work alone. And we'll talk about more about the capacity part of the equation later. But identifying those programmatic areas, and a lot of the time they cluster around specific team or specific floor, and working with the people who are responsible for those spaces is the process nowadays. And then once we identify the areas, you can see from here, there's a various way where you can slice the data and take a look at them. And here's an example from an actual space that we sensor recently. So you can see the difference between the anesthesia and pathology departments. They have very different way of working. Anesthesia usually go to the hospital, they do their work, and then they don't come back to their offices. While pathology, sometimes they have lecture and other things they need to do, so they come back to their offices and use them. And it's quite drastic difference between the two of them. And in this case, right, we can suggest different person to desk ratios. So let's say we want to convert anesthesia to a flexible workspace. And then let's say you have 100 desks. Before, for 100 offices, you have 100 people occupying them. And based on the data that we collected, most of the space being used like this in anesthesia is only 12-13% of the time. That's during work hour. We're not talking about at night and evening and so on. Even during the peak time, the busiest time, it's still only about 17-18%. So most of the time the offices are empty. At that point, our client talk to the stakeholders and using the system where, okay, if you guys need some funding to redesign the space, we'll give it to you, but in exchange for that, can you give back some of the office space that you are not using? And the project now is actually getting close to finish for this client, and they managed to convert back more than 50% of their offices in exchange to give the department money to build out their labs and changing some of the common areas. So that's how you can see, identify the problems quickly, and then the harder part is actually to go and communicate the stakeholders and then convince them. And when you have the data, it's become a bit of a easier and smoother conversation. When you're asking people to give their space back, you tend to face resistance, but when you give them something back, then that's how you can kind of communicate and exchange the fund.
So yeah, it might be quite a good time to, because Yodit, you've been involved in this project from the start, and like you were saying, they've been taking space back in terms of underused desks, with the proviso that they're creating a new space, kind of like custom for those to meet those requirements. I guess from a change management point of view, it'd be quite. Do you have any thoughts on kind of like what the process of reclaiming that space was like? Kind of who needed to be involved, and at what stages? Because I think that's a part of projects that are often quite overlooked.
Yes, absolutely. And even who to go to first, like which are the ones that we should focus on. As you can see, like with anesthesia having kind of lower average utilization, you could easily see quite a lot of change you can make. And I think being able to laser focus on the micro kind of cosms of the changes is better than necessarily kind of top-down edicts of like, okay, if going forward, everyone's going to get a one desk to 3-person ratio. You can start kind of targeting massive savings. And for this client, I believe within the first 18 months of the project, they reported something like $750,000 in savings. So really like starting from there, and then figuring out what is it that you need to convince the stakeholders, and who are the stakeholders, and how you get them to engage. So it's really like a two-way process, and dealing with kind of fears and so on, because people are used to certain routines, and communicating and involving people in the change process really kind of helps everyone go faster and also make the experience much more pleasant.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, I think that leads on quite nicely to our next point, which is tying this all into kind of strategic decision making. So I'm going to stay with you, Yodit, and just look at some examples of what it is we can actually do in practical design terms based on this data.
Yes. So one side of the question is, as we said, what is the person to death ratio? What's the correct one, so that people can do their work appropriately, but also we're not spending or having a huge footprint, unnecessary footprint. The other side of the equation is what to do about meeting rooms. There's two sides of the occupancy equation when you're thinking about a meeting room, especially the meeting rooms that are bigger than 4 people. So there is one metric which we could use with open motion sensors and so forth to say, okay, is this room occupied? So if you say, is this room occupied, you might get a graph to say this is, the utilization over the day. But what you really want is the counter side for meeting rooms, where you want to know, okay, it's occupied, but is it right for the people that are using the space? Or do we have a bunch of boardrooms that are being used by a couple of people, and but we kind of seem to be short on single person and 2 people booths and breakout spaces? So that really is kind of creates a level of granularity where you can then perhaps cut up the bigger meeting rooms and turn them into small spaces, or add more pods and really kind of unlock a lot of value from your space that way. From our side, we have algorithms that calculate recommendations. So a recommendation engine that will say to you, actually, you have this distribution of one person, two person, to all the way to, you know, large boardrooms. This is what you have on site, but what we're seeing is actually like it, you know, based on your usage and the number of people using it, here's what we think is the ideal mix for you. And at least there's a kind of a starting place when going to the workplace, kind of designers and so on. Does that make sense? I'm not sure if I covered everything, but ask me questions.
Yeah. I think that made sense to me. I really like looking at these data sets because it, like the historical way of looking at utilization, I guess, we walk around and see what's happening. And it's very easy to identify with meeting rooms in particular that there's problems going on where all the rooms seem to be empty. So the perception that space is being used well is quite an easy one to fall into. But then when you actually look at what meetings are taking place in terms of capacity versus what rooms are being used, you see very quickly that it is actually an issue that does need fixing. And then when you can then, again, as Vu was saying, tie these rooms and their max capacities to square footage kind of numbers, which are then in turn linked to cost per square foot and rental, it really starts to build up an idea of how you can actually look at securing your bottom line whilst making sure that people have the space that's actually appropriate. So it's always been a favourite tool of mine, I'd say. So I'll ask Vu to quickly blitz through this last section, which is about the kind of final stage in the change management process of you've gathered the data, you've made some changes, you now probably have a more complex, smaller space, and what do you do to manage it going forwards?
Yeah, so just a segue from the meeting rooms. Imagine when you have a bunch of new meeting rooms and you want to see how people are utilizing it, right? So we have the counter. So we have the realistic data that show exactly how many people at what point are using certain meeting rooms. But then when you look into the booking system, you can see that people are actually booking a lot more. So most of the time, according to the calendar, all the rooms are busy, which is a very common problem across all our kinds and all industries, not just the healthcare industry. So we have this solution that is tightly integrated with the sensors that track. So, you book through our apps. We have the sensor to detect if people actually show up or not. And after that, you can see the number of no-show. And a lot of the time you can see, okay, one room is booked 80% of the time, but then the number of no-show is half of that. So the room is actually being used only half of the time. And then there's another thing to the equation is like, okay, the room is for 8 person, but then the majority of the time is being occupied by only 2 people. So that's going to give you an idea of how you can keep adjusting and changing. We have some clients that actually break down a big boardrooms through movable walls into much smaller chunks where they can be flexible. You can have a large conference room for 20 people and then break it down into 3 or 4 rooms for 4 people and things like that. So another thing too is that when you have sensors, you can actually detect if somebody is in the meeting rooms, and if they don't, even though they book the room for the entire day, we can cancel, because with a sensor, we can know if the person show up or not. And there's automatic canceling, there's automatic check-in. There's no point of going into a tablet in front of the meeting rooms or using your mobile app just to hit check-in, because the sensor knows everything is automatic. You don't have to worry about all that stuff anymore. And combining the data from the sensor and data from the booking software can give you a very good idea of what people intend to do versus what they actually are doing. And at that point, you can plan the capacity over time and decide, kind of the ongoing post-deployment, post-changes. So yeah, that's give you a much more flexibility and power in how you can decide and make ongoing changes. So just to summarize, today we talk about how you can do the deployment and quickly identify the low-hanging fruits, how to engage the stakeholders early on, just to give them, kind of build the trust in the data, build the trust in the changes and the process, and then go through the change and redesign, which we can help our clients going through and communicate and understand, even working on the new design itself and make recommendations. And after that, post deployment, post changes, there's ongoing process how to keep optimizing further the space and build an efficient environment.
Wicked. Cheers, View. Sorry, I was I was chatting away on this last slide and then realised I was on mute. So thank you for jumping in, Blue. Really appreciate it. Right, that's probably all we've got time for. Thank you, everybody who joined. There'll be more in the series coming up, so please do keep an eye on your inbox. If you do want to get in touch with any questions or think that there's something that we can potentially take a look at with you, please do feel free to reach out. But yeah, have great days and thank you very much. Cheers, everybody.